Well, it was another crazy week in college football. Some big matchups. Oregon, Washington, Notre Dame, USC. Big powerhouse matchups. North Carolina, Miami was an underrated one. We're going to talk about all three today here kind of in rapid fire. Let's get straight into this video. We're going to talk first about really what was the biggest game of the week. Oregon at Washington. So Washington gets a big win over Oregon, ends up jumping 2 spots in the AP top 25. The top 4 stay the same. Washington jumps Oklahoma and Penn State. I personally would have had them also jumping Florida State. I think the win over Oregon is a bigger win than Florida State beating LSU. If we look at where is LSU on this, they're 5-2. They've lost 2 games. They're 19th. I just don't know if you really put them up there with the best teams in college football. Whereas I think Oregon is one of the best teams. I loved the fact that Oregon only drops 1 spot. Obviously, Penn State, Oklahoma, unbeaten teams, should stay there. Texas jumping over Oregon, I can understand that. Texas's win against Alabama, I think, is better than any Oregon win so far this season. Oregon has plenty of time to redeem themselves, though, with big games coming up against USC, coming up against UCLA, Washington State, etc., etc. They've got some huge mashups coming soon, including Washington State. Now, Washington State kind of surprised everybody last week by getting blown out by Arizona, but still some big matchups coming soon for the Oregon Ducks. Washington, again, I would jump them above Florida State. I just think their win over Oregon is more impressive than Florida State's over LSU. And when you're, kind of deciding between unbeaten teams, what are we doing here? Florida State has beaten LSU. That's a good win. But I'd say Oklahoma beating Texas is probably a bigger win than Florida State has. And I think Washington beating Oregon also was a bigger win than Florida State. So I'd probably move Florida State down. Maybe move them to 6th, move Washington and Oklahoma up. I do agree with Washington over Oklahoma. I just think they looked better. And I really do value that win against Oregon. Oregon and Washington really both looked incredible this week. I was very, very impressed with both teams and happy to see that Oregon didn't get penalized too much for losing a close game, right? 3 points. And really, they missed a field goal. That game should have gone to overtime. In Washington, hostile environment, came away very impressed with both teams, and I'm glad to see Oregon didn't drop too far. If we come down here, the other big win was for North Carolina, kind of a big mover here. Getting a win over Miami, which I think Miami's a good team, but they handled them. North Carolina handled them. North Carolina coming up as, I don't know if they were necessarily a surprise team, but consistently moving up here. 6-0, ACC. The ACC with Clemson not having a great year. Looking like a Florida State, North Carolina, a Duke team that's pretty good, right? Only lost to Notre Dame. And that one at a last-second kind of situation. So, you got some teams starting to rise there in the ACC. Some teams were not expecting to rise. Some teams were not used to being at the top. But man, Florida State Duke's going to be a big matchup this week. Very excited for that. Could be an opportunity for Florida State to get another, pretty solid win on their resume. The top 3, I think, we're just going to leave them as is. Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State. Ohio State really with the best win, probably, of those 3. But Georgia and Michigan just really passed the eye test. They've been really good. They've been ranked 1 and 2 pretty much all season. This week, Georgia plays Florida, which, Florida's not particularly good this year. But I think they have an opportunity to be maybe a little challenge finally for Georgia, who really I don't feel like has had much of a test so far. So gonna have my eyes on that game. Ohio State, Penn State. That's the big matchup this upcoming week. And we'll see. Penn State with an opportunity to knock off an Ohio State team and finally prove they are truly for real this season. I feel like this is kind of the Penn State we've gotten used to the last few weeks. Get off to a decent start early, kind of probably come in undefeated against an Ohio State, a Michigan, and then they get their pants beat off. And there you go. They are truly the third best team in that conference. But this season, it's a new season, give it another shot. So the other big game that we haven't talked about is Notre Dame and USC. Notre Dame coming off of kind of a brutal stretch. They lose last second to Ohio State. They win last second against Duke. Came out just bad against Louisville. Bunch of turnovers. It was ugly. Got beat. Lost the opportunity to be in the playoff. You know, the one loss to Ohio State, that was, you could overcome that. The loss to Louisville, you couldn't. So some people were wondering, what team's going to show up against USC? They came out focused, and they handedly beat USC. USC, you know, we came into this game going, this is going to be one of their really first big tests. We'd seen some trends that were not so great for their defense. Actually, their defense played okay. I would say maybe even they played well. Definitely inspired football against Notre Dame's offense, which is sputtering a little bit, but Caleb Williams and that offense, and I can't blame it all on him, but he did some things and the offense ran into some problems that I've brought up before. Caleb has a tendency to not take the easy throws, to try and do too much. And this is something we talked about a couple weeks ago when I said, I don't know if Caleb is gonna do as well in the NFL, at least initially, as we think. He's obviously talented, can make any throw on the field. But he has a tendency to try and do too much, to think he can fit balls in where he can't. And last week it bit him. 3 interceptions in the first half. And if you look at the interceptions, they're the exact kind of interceptions we have been talking about being problematic. He was trying to do too much on pretty much all 3. The first one throws it over a guy's head. Now, you can't blame it all on Caleb. The Notre Dame front 7, and really front 4 especially, kind of pushed around the USC offensive line. Really got after Caleb Williams. So he was under pressure, he was under duress. But you know what can fix under duress situations? Getting the ball out of your hands quickly and efficiently to the open man. Now, give Notre Dame's defense a ton of credit for how they covered. Benjamin Morrison is the one player who is not getting talked about enough in college football. He has held the best wide receivers last year and this year to, I think I read the stat, 39 yards. That's Marvin Harrison twice. That's Puka Nacua, who we're watching tear up in the NFL. And he did it again to the USC wide receivers. Notre Dame has a great set of corners, and they showed out. And there wasn't really a lot of openings. But I do think, if you look back at the film, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but in my opinion, you watch that game, Caleb Williams was trying to do too much. There's a few times he hung on to the ball too long. A few times he didn't just hit the easy thing. He was going for the big swing way too often. And that's kind of my complaint with Caleb, is he's super athletic, super talented, but doesn't always take the easy throws. Doesn't take what the defense gives him sometimes. And they ran into some problems here. He wasn't able to get out of the pocket as well. Couldn't make as many of those wild throws. They did score some points, but just early on, the amount of short fields he put his defense into position on because of the 3 interceptions. There's also some fumbles in this game as well. But man, just an unfortunate showing from an offense that kind of said would be able to put points up on anybody, but didn't really put points up. on the Notre Dame defense. So give them a lot of credit for that. But I do think we saw the weakness of Caleb. Now, it is the weakness of any quarterback. You pressure a quarterback, they get uncomfortable, they rush their throws, they get sacked. It's the old saying, the team that wins the game is whose quarterback was more comfortable throughout the game. I think that's a fair statement, and I think Sam Hartman was more comfortable than Caleb Williams in this game, but he didn't take what the defense give him. He tried to force some throws that he really didn't need to. He'll probably learn from this, I think, and become a better quarterback, but that's the kind of situation I was afraid of with him in the NFL. Trying to do a little too much. Running, throwing back across the field, overthrowing a receiver when he's getting hit, just doing some things that he probably shouldn't be doing. Trying to force some balls into places that they aren't. So USC drops 8 spots. It does feel a little bit like we'd seen some weaknesses in USC. Colorado almost coming back and winning, and things of that nature. That everybody was like, well, they're undefeated, so we got to keep them up there, but we're not so sure about this team. They fall to 18. I think the AP poll got it right. Notre Dame moves up to 15. I think that makes sense. The highest ranked 2-loss team. I think that's fair. You look at the other 2-loss teams, LSU, Florida State kind of handled them. Ole Miss beat them, and I don't think Ole Miss is particularly good. And they've been in some close ones with some other teams as well. Notre Dame's 2 losses are better than LSU's 2 losses. And in the top 25, the only other 2-loss team is UCLA. So, I think Notre Dame deserves that spot. Obviously, they should be ranked higher than Duke. They should be ranked higher than USC because they beat both of those teams. When you look at Notre Dame's resume, it is really pretty good with their wins. Unfortunate that they have the 2 losses. Otherwise, Notre Dame fans might be talking about a college football playoff berth still. 1-loss team with wins over Duke, Louisville, and USC. Starting to look pretty good, right? Starting to maybe move up there with the Alabamas and the Oregons and the Texas as, hey, we got some pretty good wins. Really, in that scenario, Notre Dame's wins are better than all of those teams, right? Because Alabama lost to Texas, which is the first really good. Now, they beat Ole Miss, too, which is, a highly ranked team. But Texas, 1 win over Alabama. Oregon, not really a big win, but they definitely played really good against Washington. So those teams right there, they'd be all chatting about the college football playoff implications. Should a Florida State lose to a Duke? Should Ohio State lose to Penn State? A Georgia get knocked off. So unfortunate for Notre Dame fans that they lost to Louisville, but you play the games, and if you lose, you don't deserve to get in. Happy to see Utah as well. Utah-USC, big matchup this week. That's probably the other big matchup of the week, at least in my mind. I'm really watching that Ohio State-Penn State, and then I'm watching that Utah-USC. Utah, will Cam Rising play is really the biggest question. And can they ball control? Can they maybe learn some things from Notre Dame? Utah typically plays a very aggressive style of defense, which seemed to work. Can Caleb Williams adapt, learn? We will have to see. Very excited for this week's slate of games. We'll definitely be talking about all of them next week. Make sure you tune in tomorrow so we can talk a little NFL football. I know we talked college for the most part today, but we will be talking NFL tomorrow, so we'll see you then.